Welcome to the Rebuild Podcast with your hosts, Carmen Turner and Beth Barodi. This is your space for personal and professional growth where we explore the importance of rebuild periods, time for reflection, growth, and rejuvenation. Join us for candid conversations and expert insights on embracing these phases to recalibrate your goals and discover your passions. Whether recovering from burnout or seeking a career change, the Rebuild Podcast is here to guide and inspire you. Ready to transform? Let's dive into today's episode.
Great. We are in the podcast studio again in person today. Welcome to the show. We have a very exciting show planned today. Before I get started, though, I want to recognize that we are recording on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Ben Sporer, PhD, is one of Canada's leaders in human performance. Ben is a performance strategist with a 25-year career in Olympic and professional sport and human performance. He has held multiple roles with the Canadian Sports Institute and, as an accomplished psychologist, has led support teams at Summer and Winter Olympic Games and at World Cup and World Championship events. He is the founder of Resync, a consultancy firm for organizations, athletes, and corporate clients looking to maximize their performance in high-stakes professional environments. He is an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia and the former vice president of performance strategy, research, and innovation for the Vancouver Whitecaps of the MLS. Ben has published and co-authored over 35 peer-reviewed articles, and he is also the author of Output, Optimizing Your Performance with Lessons Learned from Sport. Ben, welcome to the Rebuild.
Thank you for having me. I'll just have to clarify one thing in that.
Yes.
I'm not a psychologist for those listening. I'm a physiologist.
Sorry.
It happens all the time. My mom does it too. It's okay.
New credential just happens.
Over.
Yeah, it always happens. Just want to make sure the listeners are correct on that.
Yeah. We don't want any angry psychologists.
Exactly. I have lots of good friends that are psychologists, so I know how they feel about it. But yes.
Thank you. No, we're excited. The first male guest that we've
first
had.
man on the podcast. This is a big moment for us. Yeah. No,
I feel honored.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you're here. I'm really excited for this conversation. When Carmen first told me that she had reached out to you and first told me about your book, it really resonated because when we were first thinking about this podcast, it all kind of started with this analogy around sports teams. Like we had listened to another podcast that was talking about rebuild periods, but particularly from a sports perspective about how sports teams actively go through rebuild periods. They're not always performing. They're not always succeeding. And so I said, oh my gosh, Ben is the perfect person to come on this podcast and help us pull that thread a little bit more and talk about the whole performance mindset and start talking about how rebuilds can be a really productive and useful and necessary time for us, whether we're athletes or not. It's something that we just all need to be doing. So I'm really excited that we get to have this conversation.
Great. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I have been devouring your book. I absolutely love it. I love it because I have a background in sports too, so I can relate to so much you're saying. And I wish that I had had this when I was competing and, really not managing well all of the pressure and really only looking at growing up at winning. So that started very young. And the idea was that, we had the pressure from the soccer pitch, right? With parents like, did you win today? Like, why did you lose? And it was all about winning. And I love how you said in here something about it's about winning, but it's really about like also the output. Can you just like tell us a little bit about that and the idea of like where your book came from?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not against winning. I think actually winning is important and you have objectives that you want to try to achieve. I just think sometimes in the principle, I'll go back to the purpose of the book. The purpose was really to translate a lot of the lessons and things that I get asked a lot from people like yourselves or friends. And what do you think about this? Should we be training our kids to try to win or should we be training our kids to try to compete? And really it was coming back to saying, okay, well, what is it that happens in a high performance world? And what do I see and experience with high performance athletes all the time? And one of the things that's really neat is that when you see those serial high performers that we think of, like world champions, repeated world champions, those franchises that win over and over and over again, what are those traits that actually lead to that success? And so I actually like the word success better than winning. And the reason why is because winning is a really difficult thing to achieve. It's an outcome, right? And outcomes, unfortunately, you don't really have control over. And what I saw over sport over time is what you do have control over is your output, and hence the title of the book. And so you can be successful in many different ways and still not win, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Right? We talk about that a lot.
I was just like, Ben, are you telling me it's okay to not win sometimes?
Yeah.
Because that's a hard one for me.
I want to be
hard
really
one.
I want to make sure I clarify that because it's an important statement. Is like, I do like to win. I'll be very upfront about that. Like, I'm a highly competitive person. My family calls me the most competitive person. They can't stand playing card games with me. But I compete against myself to get the best out of me, which is actually a really positive way to compete as long as it's healthy. I think when I say that you can't control winning is that I'll use a perfect example in sport. I can prepare as much as possible. I can do all the things right. And I go up against an athlete that is just genetically better than me at the same time in my career, and they beat me. Or I get a bad call. Or I get a flat tire on a bike, even though we prepared as much as possible. Outcomes are really something you don't have full control over. You do have control over, though, how you prepare for that performance. You do have control over your output and how you get ready to perform on that given day and how you handle yourself on that given day. So when I think about success, is your metrics about success have to align to what it is you're trying to actually do. Now, you have objectives, which I think, often we talk about objectives is I do want to win the World Cup, or I do want to, for the Whitecaps, we do want to have a really long, deep playoff run and we want to finish in a certain spot within the league. That's fine. That's your benchmark. That's sort of what your really objective is. But when you evaluate your performance on that, it's really important to evaluate it on that output versus the outcome, because you don't ultimately have control in that final moment.
One of the
That's
things,
a life lesson right there.
And sometimes it's semantics, like the words, right? You think about the words, right? And people say, well, you're really just talking about process. And it's more than process. Processes are just steps that you take to get there. And that's part of your preparation. It's really important. And when you're in the moment, you have to go through those key actions. You don't focus on, did I get the result I want? I actually do the key actions. But you have to make sure that those processes are the right processes that are required to increase the likelihood that you're going to achieve your objective.
And so when you talk about that, I would imagine that type of messaging lands very differently between athletes who are performing really well and really high, and they're at kind of like the peak of their training, their career, whatever it may be, versus athletes who may have just gone through like a big loss, or they just didn't get the output or the outcome that they wanted and did everything right. And so how do you like manage that message for the one that's doing really well and is at the top of their game versus someone who's like in kind of the pit at the moment, trying to recover from something that didn't go.
The river of misery.
The river of misery, whatever you want to call it, to get that kind of motivation back up.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, I think it really depends on when you sort of get introduced to that. Are you dealing with that athlete? If you're dealing with them all along and you've gone through this process, it's quite manageable. There's absolutely moments of disappointment and despair in that moment. And that's usually not the best time to address it. That 24 to 48 hours is a really difficult time, especially if you trained 4 years to that Olympic trial and you wanted to get to that opportunity to do that and you don't succeed. But I think that's also part of those who are really successful know what it takes to increase the likelihood that they're successful. So when they put all that on the line in the moment and they prepare themselves and they can walk away with no questions, or they just got beat by someone and they did everything they possibly could do, there's a general sense of satisfaction, what I've seen in my experiences with athletes across the board. Those that don't often are... they're not really connected with what's required often to achieve it. Doesn't mean they can't be disappointed. Like, you can surely be disappointed. You don't get the job you want, you don't close the deal, whatever the situation is. Disappointment's real. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to be disappointed. But when you evaluate your success on what you're trying to do by able to increase your likelihood you could be successful in the objective. So, for example, let's say you want to win Olympic Games or in downhill skiing. You do all the preparation. You're really clear on what's required to win. You know the type of strength you need on angles of your skis. You've had all the research and innovation. You've put in all the training hours. You've got the speed. You've got everything about it. And then you get a wrong draw number. Something sits differently, or the weather changes in the middle of the event. You still get the best time that you possibly could. But if the weather changes, the conditions change, you have no control over that. Then you go out and you finish fourth. And there's nothing you can do about that. However, when you look at all those things with the right mindset of being prepared, done all that work, and you know that you increased the likelihood you are going to be successful in everything that you can control, it's easier to then, you see athletes that go through that process, it's much easier for them to acknowledge what they've done. Doesn't mean they're not disappointed at the day. It just means it's easier to then take the next steps. Okay, what did I not do, or what did I not do? It's to evaluate that situation.
For someone who is looking to then increase their output in like taking lessons learned from sport, what would that look like?
So I think the first thing that often, when I would translate these across to people outside of the sporting world, is thinking through a performance lens, right? And ultimately what that means is that whatever your performance is, the first and most important step, and this is whether it be a sport or an executive or an individual, is really being clear on what is your performance objective. So often what I hear, and I even hear this in your podcasts, the ones that I'd listen to, is that there's this realization that I was working so hard, or, and then I wanted to have kids, or I moved into this other space and I couldn't do both. And I would use that as an example. It's like, the reality is the performance's objective isn't one or the other. It's a culmination of all the things that you're trying to achieve. So we often think of things in silos, right? My job is this. My performance objective in my job is to do this. Okay, if that's fine. Then I would ask the question, what's the required output to do that from you? Is it 60 hours a week? Is it to travel globally, internationally, locally? Is it to work on weekends? Is it to be on call full time? Is it to go get more education? And if that's what it's required to achieve that, then that's okay. But then are you able to deliver that output? And if you can't, you need to understand where are the gaps that exist in that. And that's the same way we break down a sports situation. So if a sport would come and ask me a question, I would go through those exact same steps. What is their true objective? And I'll use an example that people might relate to in sport is that, let's say like the Premier League of soccer, right? Man City, who's like one of the highest budget teams in the world, is going to have a very different approach to their performance and conditions around it than a Leicester City would need to have. And so they have to be honest about what they're actually going to do and what's required for them to be successful, and can they actually do it? And they'll have to take different approaches.
What a way to take that performance lens and use it in the whole concept of burnout, right?
Totally.
Like that's totally what I'm thinking. And I think within the episodes that you've listened to, I've shared my story of burnout and coming from an executive role in mining and then needing to like really figure out life again. But that's totally it. Is like, how do you get people to recognize, even within their careers or what they're doing, what those required outputs are? Like, I think that's so smart and such a smart way to look at it, and look at it realistically of, is this something that I can commit to? Is this something that I can do? Because that just puts it all in perspective so much quicker, as opposed to it kind of catching you off guard constantly.
Totally.
And constantly you needing to be doing something else and something else and something else. And then I think the whole aspect of kind of like managing everything else, like managing life, managing kids, managing spouses, managing friends, whatever it may be. It's like that idea that you just said of it's that whole life thing. It's a holistic approach, not just the silos of, oh, my job, I can do that. Because yeah, I could do that job if I didn't have children, if I didn't have a family, if I had unlimited budget, if I had a private jet that could take me everywhere, I could totally do that job, no problem. But it's really taking in all of those other pieces and how do you fit those all together? And I can imagine with athletes, from the few professional athletes that I know, trying to manage all of that while training for something like the Olympics or a World Cup or whatever it may be. That's got to be tricky. That's got to be really tricky to manage all of those levers.
Absolutely, it's tricky. And I think that, I think there's two things that really stand out from what you just said there. And the first one is that we're not always really honest. I don't mean that in a bad way, but we're not really honest about what our performance objective is. Like, and I'll give you an example. I've done many rebuilds myself personally over my career, so I really connected with your podcast. But I had when I finished school and I was working, and I was one of the leading physiologists in Canada working in the Olympic system. I was traveling like 120, 130 days a year on the road. Trina, my partner, and I were perfect. She was in her career. She was doing her thing. And then we decided we wanted to have kids. Well, we kept doing the same thing we were doing. And the reality is that our objective had changed. It wasn't just me building a career and having a relationship with Trina. It was me building a career that worked with our kids, because I wanted to be home and coach and be around, and with Trina, because she was going to be, we wanted to have someone at home to be with the kids. So our objective completely changed, and I needed to set back, and both of us need to step back and say, how do we rebuild that? And so it was actually another piece that led to the concept of how does the same lessons I'm teaching with athletes work in my own personal life?
That's such a good example, because what we often see is that and feel free to jump in here, but what we see is that we may be going through a rebuild and the objectives change, but it's also when we're not hitting the marks that we think we should be hitting, we're telling stories about ourselves that are just not true, rather than looking at it from a neutral place, as you're saying, like, well, maybe I just didn't hit the right mark because it was over, it was like not realistic or for whatever reason. But it's like those stories that we tell ourselves. Do you ever catch that with?
See it all the time. 100%, you nailed it.
Well, it also, it feels like very relevant for parents. It's like you're not hitting the marks that you used to, and why am I not hitting them anymore? Like why can't I achieve that anymore without giving the thought of right, because you have children. I feel like, I've gone through that. I have a 1-year-old at home right now, and that this last year's been one of my major things is how am I not doing more? All of that was easy before. I was doing all of that before. How have I not done that? And it's right. I'm constantly reminded by both my husband and everyone around me. It's because you have a baby at home.
Yeah.
You have a baby. Come on, that's why you can't do it. And I've never thought of it about looking at, you need different outcomes. You need to think about what that looks like.
Yeah, and it's shifted. And so I think we often relate, going back to two things there, that one, how do we measure whether or not we're doing enough? We silo those measurements in buckets, right? So you silo it in my career compared to X. Well, their situation might be completely different, right? So how do I measure that? I measure it against that. Well, in some situations, depending on what you're trying to do, that might be the benchmark, but it might not be them. It might be the benchmark. But how does that actual benchmark adjust for yourself personally? And so we look at those measurements in silos as opposed to a collective. And I use an analogy in the book about the pitcher of water with the multiple glasses on the table. And you have one pitcher of water and you have 8 glasses. Maybe your pitcher of water represents your entire capacity to do, to be, right? And I just use that as an example. But you only can really adjust that a little. You only get 24 hours in a day, and you only have so much bandwidth in your brain that you can handle, and cognitive loads you can take on, and your physical load's a certain amount. But you can choose to fill up 1 or 2 of those glasses, or you can choose to fill up 8 of them and know that you're going to get 8, but you're not going to be able to measure it against a full glass. You're choosing, you're making those choices where you want to put those buckets. And so when it comes back to identifying with that objective for your career and how these shifts or rebuilds are happening, is that which glasses are you choosing to fill out? Because it is a choice we all make. Just like the athlete makes a choice to be an elite athlete, or they choose to want to compete at the highest level. We make choices every day to chase a career, have kids, and be active, or but we have to recognize that we only have so many of those glasses. And so if we now evaluate our performance on the number of glasses we've identified at the heights that we're trying to get them to, now we can start to say, yeah, we're actually making really great progress. I'm actually doing a lot. I don't know if you swear on this, but
yeah,
I
you
could
can
easily
swear. It's
like,
all right.
I'm doing a shit ton, right?
Yeah,
I'm like, holy, how am I getting this done?
Yeah.
Wow, I'm actually doing amazing. But if I'm looking at one of those glasses and say, well, this person's over here and I'm just here. Well, yeah, and that's when those stories come in, like, I should be doing more. I need to focus on this. So we have this disconnect sometimes, and this happens in athletes all the time. It's one of the bigger challenges, I think, for people that are working and supporting high-performance sport, is when athletes have a disconnect with what they really are trying to achieve, or what it takes to actually achieve their increased likelihood they could have their success of their objective. But we have a disconnect when we're looking at this glass and we say, I'm measuring myself on the full glass, but I'm actually really, this is my objective. So I'm actually at it or above it. I'm really doing a great job. Right?
So when you're working with athletes who are training for something big, like they're going for something, and taking that idea of these, you have these 8 glasses that you could be filling in whatever capacity that you want. I'm assuming that a lot of those athletes, like, they really have to be intentional about which one of those cups they're putting their time and effort into. So
everybody needs to be intentional.
Not being a professional athlete, I would immediately just start worrying about the cups that I'm not filling. And that mental game would then obviously play into how you're showing up for training, how you're working, how you're doing that. So how do you work with them and coach them to really just like be okay with the 4 glasses they're not going to really touch, and really focus on those 4 that are like really key for what their training is? Because I would assume, like, even especially with those trainings, like these, I'm talking about like when you're like you're going for the high performance, like you need that focus, you need that dedication. Like, how do you make it so that they're not just somewhere in the back of their brain worrying endlessly about the other 4 cups that aren't getting attention?
Great question. This happens all the time.
Yeah.
Like, so this is more common than it is uncommon. And I think often even just looking at, like, individual athletes or teams, professional sports teams, everything says everything's great and professional. And there's a lot of people doing really good work in professional sports teams. But one of the biggest challenges I see, whether it be a national sports team, an individual athlete, a professional sports team, is that very first phase. It's really important. Be really clear and intentional about what's your objective, and be honest about it, right? Because that is the first and foremost, absolutely most important thing. And if we can't, so going to your question, I always come back to the question is, why are you a professional athlete? Why are you doing the sport you're doing? What is it that drives you about that? And I mean, everybody's up on the start with why, and and it sort of gets, but it's there for a reason, like, and you can look at it in lots of different ways. But the reality is that if you're not connected with why you're doing your sport or your job or your choices as a family, it's really hard to be intentional when it's tough to be to get those sessions in, to get the days in. So going back to the question around the athlete, when it's how do we prioritize on those 4 or 5 glasses, it always comes back for what they started with. This is why I'm doing it.
Being intentional about saying no then as well.
Yeah. And then once you go through that point, you're saying, okay, if this is my objective, and I talk about this a little bit in steps in the book, but if this is my objective, what's required to increase the likelihood? What's the output that's required to increase the likelihood that I'm successful in achieving that? Okay. And you might, once you articulate that clearly, you might say, wow, wait a second, to audit myself. I'm actually pretty close in a lot of these, or I'm quite a ways away, and I might need this much time to get there, and allows you then set much more realistic goals. But then the big part about that is that it allows you to prioritize what are the things you need to do.
Yeah.
And so the next phase I'd say about, to add to your question, is like, how do you get them to think about that? Because it's really easy to get distracted.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I need to strength train. I need to do my skill training. I need to make sure I'm on the snow all the time, or I'm on the ice all the time.
Yeah.
And I use a concept I refer to as net performance impact, right? So when you're looking at all the things you can do, what are the 2 or 3 things that have the greatest net performance impact? And what do I mean by that? I mean, if, let's say, for example, I have to take away time for training for an athlete that says, we're going to do less technical team training because you need to spend time doing more strength training in the gym, or we're going to do more strength training, but you're going to go into technical training, you're tired. Well, it's not just the benefit I get here. I have to actually think about what are the negative sides on this, and how do those two interplay for the net performance impact? Because I might then say, I really don't want to work on this,
Right.
because it takes way too much over here.
Yeah.
Right.
Huh. I think so I was saying, as we were just kind of sitting here and getting ready for recording, that I'm participating in this boxing challenge. So it's called Champs for Charity, and Mandy Bugeaud, who is an Olympic athlete, Olympic boxer. I think she's an 11-time national champ is what her record is on boxing. She runs this. She's a friend of mine. She almost promised me, but couldn't 100% told me that I wouldn't break my nose. And so I reluctantly said yes. And so we are doing this training. And so it's this really, we take, it's been 14 weeks of training in total. And then we get into the ring and we do a boxing match. And it's all for a fundraiser for McMaster's Children's Hospital in Ontario. And I was sharing that she's brought in her own sports psychologist that she's worked with to do a lot of this with us. And I think one of the things that she said to us in one of our past trainings was the support system that you need around you in order to show up and do the training, in order to show up and perform, in order to show up and be present in the trainings, and not be distracted by everything else going around. And I think that has got to be so key. And I mean, it relates, I think, to sport. It relates to just life in general, is like, you can't do it alone. And these sorts of commitments are commitments. When you are figuring out what do you want, your outcome to be for you, that also takes all of your support around you, having those conversations and making sure that you're relying on others around you, so that you're not stressed or not worried, or again, shuffle in the cups the way that they need to be shuffled in order so that you're not the one managing all of that. And I just think that can be, we sometimes expect that we have to put it all on ourselves and we have to do it all really well and we have to do it all perfectly. And so that idea of like, again, those requirements, it's like, what are the other people and who are the other people required to help you with this? And I think about, the conversations that I had with my husband before saying yes to this challenge, being like, you're going to have to do more pickups from school. You're going to have to do more lunches. You're going to have to do night times. You're going to have to do bedtime, because I'm going to be at the gym and I do a lot of evening trainings. And on Saturdays, we do a training. And so I'm going to be gone on Saturdays. And just like getting the yes from everyone else, to have you kind of thrive and build. And I think that kind of translates across the board on how you set yourself up for success, and just really make sure that the proper resources are coming in at the right times and you're not trying to just push a boulder up a hill for the sake of it yourself, and just really make sure that if I'm going to show up, I'm going to do this training, I'm going to be present, I know that everything else is taken care of because I've built that foundation up behind me before jumping off the deep end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you see that a lot in, I refer to that often as like, you need a culture of high support, high performance around you. And so you have to have a team on a regular basis. So that team could be people who are like supporting you as a trainer, or it could be your partner. It can be your kids, and everybody sort of picks up. So that's your team that around you. And you need to identify who on your team you need to help you achieve. Because when you go through your sort of intentional process of saying, what is it that's really required for me to achieve this? You're going to find things that are like, whoa, I need some help with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you don't, then it just gets left to the wayside, and then that starts to become a bit of an anchor for you, right?
Totally. Well, it causes anxiety, causes everything, causes stress for everybody involved, for sure.
Yeah. And that's the other thing I think you just touched on there, which is really important. I think it's we forget about it often. We think about things in silos, but the impacts that one has on the other. So if you think about, I talk about the core four, I think every performance has. It's got a physical, it's got a mental, it's got a technical and a tactical component to it. So whether it be a job, whether it be a relationship, you can put things in each of those buckets. But we often look at how we prepare ourselves in each of those buckets separately. But when you actually have to produce them, they're an integrated output. It doesn't just mean I just go physically and ride my bike if I'm an athlete. I do have to mentally know that I'm not anxious about some stuff that's back at home. I have to be able to mentally push through pain. I have to be able to, so I can I have to be physically strong enough so I can get the proper technical, like an hour into my ride. So your performance is actually an integrated output of that. And whether it's an athlete or whether it's a parent or an executive or whoever it might be, when you think about your performance, you have those attributes of what's required in your performance. Just the levers or the size of those might be very different than an athlete, but they do exist.
You said those were physical, mental, technical, and tactical.
Yeah.
Smart. Very smart. Yeah.
How do you have advice for, because one of the challenges that I see professionally, but also like when I think back in my own career, looking at like keeping your eyes on your own lane and not looking at, well, what is she doing? What is she doing? A perfect example, when I was playing soccer at university, I was in the national program, and I played goalkeeper for soccer, and I was the backup pretty much for this goalkeeper who was phenomenal. And her name was Karina LeBlanc.
Yeah.
One of the best goalkeepers to ever come out of Canada.
Yeah.
I know now, but at the time, I like just beat myself up, and like I saw that documentary on Stephanie Labbe. It was so good. I resonated so much with everything
she's
she went through.
She's an amazing person, by the way.
Yeah, and she's come out with her talking about mental health and how that impacted her, and I was like, I can just resonate. I felt that so much as a goalkeeper. There's only one position, and like you said, you can't control the outcome, right? Yeah. So what are your thoughts on, so now I see this a lot, is that we tend to look at like, well, look at what so-and-so is doing, especially with social media. Like, they're killing it. I'm not killing it. So do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, it's tough. Like, first, social media does do that.
Yeah.
And we're all prone to it. I go through the same thing. I look at other people and what they're doing. But I think one of the things that's really important, what I try to always relate to, whether it be athletes or individuals I work with, is that always come back to what's your performance? What's your performance objective? And I'm not saying don't look at things. You need to be aware of what other people are doing. Otherwise, things change. Things are always dynamic. Benchmarks might change as what's required to be successful. You need to know what the other opposition doing in sport, because if the benchmarks change, and MLS is a great example. 5-6 years ago when we started this performance strategy in 2018, the league was very different. It was pre-COVID. League was different. Jump ahead 6 years, the types of players that are coming into the MLS now, the budgets are way bigger.
Yeah, that's right.
The benchmarks moved. And if we don't pay attention to that, our strategy has to adapt and go through that process. So you do need to be aware of it. But I think you always have to come back to being really clear again, what's your objective and what's your strategy? Because just like sports teams, some people have different resources. They have different teams around them. They have different access. Good one in MLS is that American teams are in the US. We're in Canada, where travel's a lot different. Every travel's across the international border except for one a year. So whereas only one for every team in the US is across the border. So it's just a different and dynamic. So when you're looking at those other people, it's great to be aware of it. I do encourage people to say, be aware, but also know that their situation isn't your situation. And if you're looking at them thinking, well, I should be doing what they're doing, know that they're looking at you thinking they should be doing what you're doing. Because the flip side is exactly the same.
It's true.
And they go through the same process.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So how do you work with your how do you work with your executives? Like, how do you take all this and make it more applicable to their work?
Yeah, so great question. Quite often, the biggest way I typically end up working with executives is usually it's a physical goal. I'm a physiologist by training.
Yeah.
And so I typically end up working with them and they have some big ambition to do something. But the first phase is always about, okay, first of all, identifying what that ambition is. And they think it's often, I'm going to do a Grand Fondo. Or I'm going to run a marathon, or
get in the boxing ring.
Yeah, I'm going to get in the boxing ring. There you go. You got it. Exactly. I'm going to get in the boxing ring.
Yeah.
But then as we go through that process, which is really, starting with what is your true objective? And I ask them, is that really your objective? Well, I also run a, $500 million company. I'm in the middle of a growth phase for my company. Actually, I'm also a parent. I want to go coach my kids. Okay, well then this is really your objective. So you want to achieve X while still doing all these things. So this is what you were doing before, but now you're adding another piece to it. You're not just going to do this. So that discussion always happens. And so that's where that process about saying, so if let's say they are running a marathon and they're doing a Fondo, we would then identify what are their parameters that exist within that. And then we'd actually build out a plan for them. But the other thing that I think that's really important for people to understand is you can train there's a lot of people that will train athletes just to do an event like box. But I always ask the question, and I would work with a client that says, okay, well, what's the impact, not just the training or not just the obvious, like on your time, but what's the impact on your cortisol levels? Or what's the impact that's crossing over from fatigue and recovery that's going to change your nutrition that you need to focus on to support, your cognitive function while you're working with your business still? Or what's going on here that we need to be aware of in your sporting event? So I draw those parallels often with a client.
So just listening to you chat and working the way that you're working with executives, I've never heard of this type of like coaching and support where you take that physical goal and bring that to an executive. We hear executive coaches. I've worked with executive coaches. I think about my previous boss, who I just love and adore. He's like the biggest hockey nut you'll ever meet in your life. You talk to him, all he does is talk in hockey metaphors, and that's like how he runs business. And he's a physical guy. He coaches his sons, or he was coaching his sons' hockey teams. We had a company hockey team because that's how he related, right? And I think about the way that you're talking about coaching, and it makes so much sense for executives, especially with him. He's the CEO of a mining company, so he runs $1 billion plus company as his day job. And I think what a smart way to do that, because again, then relating it back to this boxing thing, one of the things or the reasons why I did it was because I needed something physically hard to help stimulate my brain to do something. And I wanted to do something differently. And it has had just an immediate domino effect where I'm eating better. I'm much more aware about what I'm putting in my body. I'm sleeping better. I'm not as tired, even though, you think I should be, like I would be, because I'm exerting so much more energy. But I think for executives, that's such a brilliant way to work with them from a coaching perspective. Because the benefits of having something that is physically hard and that physical goal to work towards just has so much benefit for then how they show up in their day-to-day life, and they show up in their job and all of those like positive effects. And I've just like listening to you share that, I've never heard that type of coaching before, where it brings in that physical element to it. So I think that's absolutely brilliant in what you're doing.
Thanks. I think it's definitely you're spot on with that. And I think one of the things that often happens with clients that usually get started with them for one of these event goals, and as we work through it, most of my clients, lots of the clients I've worked with, some of them are 20 years. Like they just stay on to continue, because the benefits that they see back the other way are actually a lot more than they ever expected. And I think of it like, if going back to how I work with clients, I look at myself primarily as more like a program director. But I have the strong physiology background sense. So and understand that this is all an integrated output that they're trying to do at the end of the day, and help them appreciate that, a role as an executive, like a CEO of a mining company, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of travel. There's a lot of, meetings out.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of dinners.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I try to really emphasize is that, well, we can use this physical goal for you to actually help you be better at this.
Yeah.
Right? Because we can increase your energy levels. We can improve or maintain your cognitive function day to day. We can improve your sleep. We can do all these types of things. And it's not, I would say, okay, we're just going to do a sleep watch on you and we're going to say, hey, now you sleep 15 minutes longer.
Yeah.
But why these things? Why these physical aspects relate over here? How does the nutrition help you in here?
Yeah.
And so that's crossed over.
It's just so brilliant. Like, it's because it goes especially once you're at that level. Not that you don't have more to learn from like how to run your business, but like you got to that level for a reason. You're good at the business side.
Really
you've got
good.
the
You're
acumen, you're technical, you've got the
tactical.
expertise. But it is about that, like, how do you maintain it and how do you use like physical work and physical goals to help maintain that? I just think that's brilliant. I think
Same
that's
thing as an
totally
athlete.
brilliant.
An athlete would be the best athlete in the world. They're highly technically skilled. They're really tactical. And often what we do is we just tweak systems to help them be the best that they can be for as long as they can be, and more sustainable performances.
Do you find that the people that you work with, executive athletes, whoever it may be, that they just naturally have this tendency to want to be continuous learners and that they want to continue to develop and they don't have that ego kind of stopping them from wanting to continue to perform better?
Yes.
As
soon as you said the word ego, no,
Now
like,
you're going a bit too far.
so first of all, there's two things there. One, yes, every high performer has a growth mindset in my mind, right? I think you have to have a growth mindset to be a high performer. Sometimes they're a little bit some are a little bit more difficult to sway or educate or inform. I think because people are successful, their mindset of why they're successful. And this is an interesting thing that I see in sport a lot, but it's also something that I love discussing with people, is that you can be really successful in spite of good choices, right? Right? And a true high performer knows whether they were successful by their actions or in spite.
Right.
Right? You don't celebrate successes. Even that you can be successful without actually fully earning that. And if you are celebrating those and not realizing how or why you actually got that, to me, you're not quite the high performer that you want to be.
It's like kind of like that. Don't get too excited about the wins, but don't get too down about the losses.
Yeah.
Too. Like, don't make it mean.
And that's often talked about. People say that, but people often say, well, what do you mean by that? Right. And I think that's where I always go back to being really clear and identifying what's the output that's required to increase the likelihood that you're successful. And this is why it always circles back to this, is that if you can really articulate what that is. And I use an example with the Whitecaps. We had this great strategy that we implemented, and there's some amazing people that have been part of that strategy at the Whitecaps. But when we started the rebuild in 2018, early 2019, and we then hired on the sporting director, Axel Schuster, who's an amazing job to lead that organization. There were some really clear objectives to be a top 4 contender in the conference going forward. But we had to identify what's required to actually be that. We couldn't just say that's what we wanted to be, and then, we got lucky one year, because 3 years in after the 6-year rebuild, we were in the playoffs and we were excited. Well, but we had metrics. We had to define what those metrics were that knew that's what it means to be a top 4 team. And how do we produce those? How do we produce those outputs, regardless of what the score was? And as and what we found is that each year we got closer to the last 2 years. We were actually in that range, and we were meeting those metrics. But what was the next shift that was changing? Because the league was changing.
Right.
However, if we don't have those metrics and we get lucky, we think we're doing things that are, we actually lead down the wrong path.
Or
and
if
you
we
get inconsistent performance.
Or if we get unlucky, like I can think of a time where you're heading like this in your career, like top right corner, but then, I don't know, there's a leadership change, like recalibrating what does success look like? How do I fit into that?
And what happens often, this happens in sport quite a bit too, is that, we lost the first 3 games, let's change everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, if you've got really clear metrics, and we knew that we were actually, like a few seasons ago, we lost our home opener, and then we maybe won one, I can't remember, out of the first 5 games. But our metrics were like, they were top in the league for what we were trying to do. And we were actually hitting it. We just were not executing in the final moment. So we didn't need to change a whole bunch of stuff. Everything was working. Everything was where we wanted to be. And then slowly it just corrected itself as we put those little things in place as a club.
Yeah.
But to your point, if you don't get the result or the outcome, why didn't you have to understand why you didn't get that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're allowed to evaluate, you know what, our output was actually better than we thought it was going to be for these reasons.
It's almost like gamifying it.
It is totally gamifying.
It's like totally just like constantly evaluating, constantly testing, constantly not just being so set on like one thing, but like just constantly tweaking and gamifying your whole approach and how you actually achieve it. Yeah.
And in a sport world, you can do that. In a personal world, that's not as realistic for people, right? You don't need to have these specific metrics, but you can have discussions with your spouse. How am I doing? How are things going, right? You can.
But it's not so black and white, right?
Yeah,
it's not like you got it or you didn't, or like you passed or you failed. It's like having those moments of being like, okay, wait, that didn't actually work out the way that I thought it would. Why? How do we manage that and how do we move forward? So I think that's super cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So insightful.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite sport that you like to work with or favorite?
Oh, honestly, I don't have a favorite sport. I just love sport. I've loved sports since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I love like learning new sports too. Sometimes I'll work in a sport I've never worked in.
Yeah.
And then you learn it for what it is and what are the nuances of it. And it's often because whenever I work in a new sport, I regularly, the leadership coaches or high performance directors will always say, well, our sport's unique, it's different. And I always wait for that conversation and it comes and I'm like, well, I actually would disagree. I don't think it's any different. It has different characteristics to it, but the things that are going to drive performance are still the same.
The building blocks are...
The fundamentals to performance don't change whether you're a person, like an athlete, an entertainer.
Yeah. I mean, well, clearly, if you can take the foundation on like the blocks that you have and you can use that with athletes, or you can use that with executives, or you can use that with your spouse, or you can use it with whatever. It's like that performance lens, as you said, is able to be used across many different fronts.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's lots of ways to do different things too.
Yeah.
Right? Which is great.
Awesome. If you were to give kind of like final advice to people listening, what would it be when looking at like ultimate performance?
Start at the very beginning to be really honest about what's your performance objective. Like,
and
for
be
your
super
listeners,
honest about it.
Be super honest about it because we aren't always. And often it's just a few extra questions, right? It's to say, is that really what my objective is? Or, well, I also want to make sure I'm going to coach my kids because I really want to do that. So that's actually part of it. I got to make sure that I think that that's part of my objective. I want to be a good partner, a good parent.
It's other things too, right? Like,
it's more than just we get caught up in our sport, in our jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Yeah.
They're huge. Like, it's not to say it's not important.
Yeah.
But how do you do those with the big picture? What is the true objective? Because when you leave those other pieces out, you're potentially leaving out big components that impact that performance in that single thing you're looking at.
What's something in 2025 that you're excited about?
Well, I think I'm most excited. Well, a couple of things. My daughter graduates this year, which is great.
Amazing.
Graduates high school.
Graduates high school, yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. That's exciting.
I just finished off the project with the Whitecaps at the end of December. So end of 2024. Thanks. It's been a great project. Super excited for them. I'm excited to watch them move to the next stage, which is great. But I think that it frees up a lot of my time. So I'm really excited to be open to thinking, exploring. I'm doing a little bit of a rebuild myself right now.
Right. Oh, I love
it's
that.
a great position to be in.
So many of our guests have been in or are going through rebuilds now. So I love that.
How do people find you? How do people find out more about you? Where can they contact you or look at the work that you're doing?
On LinkedIn.
Okay.
Ben Sporer, LinkedIn. Our website is www.resync.ca, resync.ca.
Okay.
I'm not really active on social media.
Okay.
Everything's usually word of mouth, but those are the two main places. And
okay. Great. I feel like I have a couple people that I want to introduce you to just right away with the way that you're talking about this that I think would be really valuable for them. So I'm glad we could have this conversation. Carmen gave me a copy of your book, so I told her before today. I'm a big reader, and I have a 4.5-hour flight home tomorrow, and so I always spend those flights reading. So
you should be able to read it in a flight.
So,
it's designed to be a quick read. So.
Great. So I'm looking forward to diving into it and reading more. But just thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us about this. I think a lot of people are going to get some good insights out of this podcast or out of this episode.
Thanks so much, and I love the podcast. I love the concept of rebuild.
Yeah, so do we. So do we, and everyone goes through them. So we just got to keep normalizing it. That people just got to lean in when they're going through it. So. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
If this podcast resonates with you, it would mean so much to us if you could take 30 seconds to follow or subscribe to The Rebuild. This will make sure that you never miss an episode. Just go to the Rebuild Show page on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and just tap the plus sign on the right-hand corner or click follow. This is super important to our podcast. While you're there, if you'd be willing to leave us a 5-star review and share an episode you love with a friend, we would be incredibly grateful. We love you and appreciate you very much.